Hold your hand up in front of your face tonight, in the darkest room of your home, and wait. Give your eyes a minute. A shape will come, an edge, a paleness, a shadow moving against deeper shadow. Because there is light in that room with you. There nearly always is. It slips under the door, around the curtain, off a street lamp 3 houses away, out of the little standby lights of the machines we live with. Your eyes have never once been asked to do without. And that's the strange truth hiding inside an ordinary evening. You have almost certainly never been in the dark, not the true dark, the kind with no edges and no direction, where the hand an inch from your nose simply is not there. For most of human history, that darkness arrived every evening, the way weather arrives. People raised children inside it, worked and prayed and fell in love inside it. Then, in hardly more than a century, we put it out so thoroughly that more than 8 in 10 of us now live under skies that never fully go black at all. So tonight we're going to give the dark one night back. Early December 1725, a small market town in the English Midlands, where the sun goes down before 4 in the afternoon and will not rise again until 8 the next morning. 16 hours of night on schedule every day that month. We'll live it from the inside, in the house of a shoemaker, with his wife, his children, and the girl who tends the fire. Though for most of it, the body in the bed will be yours. You'll bar the door as the light fails, learn what an hour of flame actually cost, and climb a staircase that has to be read with the fingertips. Somewhere past midnight, you'll wake into blackness, and nobody, anywhere, will think that's strange. The whole world once woke in the middle of the night on purpose and had a name for the hour. We'll come to it, and later still there will be something above the rooftops, something that stood over every night like this one, and that our own nights have quietly erased. It would be easy to hear all this as a story about deprivation, about how hard the nights were before we fixed them. But the people in that house weren't waiting to be rescued. The dark, to them, was less an outage than a country, one with rooms, rules, even a kind of furniture. A spare hour of peace, a sky worth the cold, a charm against the fear. They were not simpler than we are, and they were not sadder. They were the same people, set down in a darker room, and watching them live there, we might finally see what our own bright evenings are standing on. But before the shutters close, if you find yourself drawn to these quiet visits inside the ordinary past, the small hours the history books walk past, consider subscribing, and we'll keep letting ourselves into these vanished evenings together. And once you know which modern comfort you'd find hardest to hand over for a night like this one, leave it in the comments. For most of us, if we're honest, it's the light. Now let's go back, down a narrow street of timber houses on a December afternoon 300 years ago, in the last grey hour before the dark comes in. The light starts to go a little after 3. There's nothing so definite as a sunset. The sun has kept low all day, rolling along the rooftops behind a sheet of December cloud, and now it simply lets go. Grey deepens in the street by the minute. You are standing at the door of the shoemaker's house, with the cold coming up through your shoes, smelling frost and wood smoke. From here you can watch the far end of the lane grow vague, the way a room fills with water in a dream, quietly from the bottom up. Doors are shutting all along the street. The day's business is wrapping itself up with the light, because here the light is the business day. Whatever the sun no longer pays for, nobody can afford to keep doing. Around you, the town is closing like an eye. The girl comes past your knees driving the hens in, scolding them individually, and somewhere behind the house, a last bucket comes up from the well. Market boards are folded and carried. Inside, the shoemaker's wife counts her children by sound while her hands go on working. None of it is hurried, and all of it is practiced. Wood in, water in, animals in, tools in, movements made 10,000 times, in an order so old nobody thinks of it as an order. They call this hour the shutting in, when a house is turned, piece by piece, into a vessel that can ride out the night. The windows go dark first, and the windows deserve a moment, because they are not what we'd assume. On this street, glass is wealth. Most openings are closed with plain wooden shutters, or with oiled cloth or paper that lets through a brown, forgiving dusk, or with panes of horn scraped thin enough to glow. The shoemaker's 2 glazed casements downstairs are his quiet pride, and until quite recently the law would have agreed with him about what they were: property, not house. His grandfather's generation unhooked their windows when they moved and carried them along, and old inventories list glass with the beds and the brass among the things a family owns rather than the walls that merely hold them. A house was a shell. The glass was yours. The shutters that swing over those panes are guarding treasure then, but that's the smallest part of their work. A shutter is armor against the cold and against thieves, both of which do their best work in the dark, and it is a wall against something subtler which this age takes as seriously as we take germs, the night air itself. Ask anyone on this street and they'll tell you that damp evening air carries fever and that a sleeping body should be shut away from it. They are wrong about the mechanism and right about nearly everything they've observed. Fever does haunt the marshy lowlands. Autumn mists and sickness do arrive together, and in fever country, a window sealed against bad air happens also to be sealed against the mosquitoes that truly carry it. This is careful reasoning built on sound observation and one missing fact, which is most of what science ever is in any century, including ours. By 5 o'clock, it is done. The bar drops into its brackets across the door, and the last shutter goes home with a soft knock of wood on wood. You stand in the middle of the downstairs room and notice what has happened to the window you were watching through. The grey rectangle has gone. Not dimmed, but gone, absorbed into the wall around it. Outside, the lane you walked an hour ago has lost its edges. If cloud keeps the moon shut away tonight, a traveller out there will not see the road beneath his own feet. Nights like that had names of their own. The Spanish called them noches ciegas, blind nights, and every language in Europe knew precisely what they meant. The dark settling on this town will sit here more than twice as long as the daylight it follows, and it will do the same tomorrow and every day deep into the new year. The house is snug now. It is also, by our measure, nearly blind. A small wooden vessel, battened tight, adrift until morning, but not quite lightless. Across the room, low on the hearth, one thing still moves: the fire, burning small under the wife's watchful eye, the only light this family will never have to buy by the inch. Everything the evening is about to become depends on that handful of flame and on a piece of arithmetic older than anyone in the house about exactly how much brightness a working family can afford. From a wooden box beside the chimney, the shoemaker's wife lifts something that looks, at first, like a long dry straw. It is a rush, a river plant cut in high summer, soaked and peeled until only one pale rib is left to hold the pith, then drawn through scalding fat and set aside to stiffen. She touches its tip to the embers, waits for the small flame to take, and clips it slantwise into an iron stand on the table. What it gives could hardly be called brightness. A bead of fire the size of a thumbnail, steady and slightly sweet with the smell of bacon. This is the evening's lamp, and she made it herself in September, out of a weed and the skimmings of her cooking pot. You would think the fire behind her would light the room, and this is one of the quiet illusions we carry about the past. A hearth fire is generous with heat and miserly with light. Across a whole evening, this one will shed about 1/6 of what a single candle would. So the room is not lit, it is pooled. There's the low orange glow along the hearthstones, and there is the rushlight's small circle, where the wife's needle flashes and the shoemaker draws his thread through a boot sole. And beyond those two islands, the family simply sits in the dark, faces half found by the fire, feet and floor and ceiling gone. Nobody minds, and nobody reaches for more light, because everyone in this room can price it. The sums were written down for us, as it happens, by a country parson later in the century, a Hampshire clergyman with a naturalist's patience, who timed a rush of 28 inches and watched it burn for 57 minutes. He worked the figures all the way through and found that a poor family could buy 5.5 hours of what he called comfortable light for a farthing, the smallest coin in the kingdom. 1.5 pounds of rushes, he reckoned, would light a careful household for a whole year. Set against that farthing, the shop-bought alternative looks very different. A halfpenny candle of tallow, rendered mutton fat, that smokes, drips, smells faintly of rancid meat, and drowns its own wick unless someone trims it every quarter of an hour. It burns 2 hours, give or take, twice the money for a fraction of the light, though the town labourer with no bacon pot to skim and no stream to cut rushes from never had the choice. For him, the bought candle was the only light there was. Above tallow, the ladder climbs quickly out of reach. Beeswax, the flame that smells of honey and burns clean and straight, costs 4 to 8 times as much, which is why in this family's life it appears only at church, holding its steady light over other people's prayers, and over every candle in England since 1709 hangs the King's duty. Light is taxed by the pound, and dipping candles at home without paying it is against the law. The rushlight survives as the loophole, too humble, too homemade, too poor to be worth an excise man's ink. The law, without meaning any kindness by it, left the poor their weed. Economists have since done these sums for worlds like this one, and the answer is the kind that takes a moment to land. The brightness of one modern living room for one ordinary evening would have cost this shoemaker roughly 3 days of his labour. Not the house lit, not the street. 1 room, 1 evening, 3 days' work. That is the arithmetic under everything this family does after sundown. Why the fire is kept small. Why the rush is pinched out the moment hands stop working. Why nobody here has ever seen their own bedroom by strong light. They do not sit in darkness because their world is empty. They sit in darkness because an evening spent there is the only evening they can afford. And a farthing in this house is still a farthing. Which explains the loveliest habit of the pre-industrial night. If light is dear, you share it, and so, on many evenings, households fold themselves together. 6 families, 1 fire, 1 flame, the women spinning, the men mending what the day broke, wool winding, stories going round, the young stealing looks across the glow. In France they gave the custom a name, the veille, the watching, but it needed no name to work. Find a place on the bench among them and you are watching energy policy conducted as friendship. Company was simply how you afforded an evening. And flame was so precious that it could even stand in for time itself. In London, within living memory, the Navy sold entire ships by the inch of candle. Last bid before the stub died took the prize, and the diarist Samuel Pepys, watching one such sale, learned the winning bidder's secret. In the instant before a candle dies, its smoke begins to curl downward, and by that small grey signal, the man knew exactly when to speak. Here the rush has burned down to its final inch too. The wife wets 2 fingers, pinches it dark, and in the same moment, out across the cold roofs of the town, a bell begins to count. 8 o'clock, carrying a single instruction that is older than anyone awake to hear it. The bell is not telling the time, it is giving an order. The word for it came over with the Normans. Couvre-feu, cover the fire, and 6 centuries of English mouths have worn it down to curfew. People like to say the conqueror invented it to grind the conquered English down, keeping them dark in their houses like prisoners, but the old records give that story no support at all. The truth is humbler and a good deal more sensible. This is a town built of timber, plastered with lime, roofed in thatch and lit entirely by open flame, which means that every household's fire is every neighbour's business. A single ember left to wander while a family sleeps can take the street with it before the street wakes up. So the bell says, each evening, the one thing a wooden town most needs said. Before you sleep, put your fire to sleep first. Watch how it's done, because nobody here would dream of simply dousing it. The wife rakes the coals into a tight glowing heap at the back of the hearth and sets over them a dome of fired clay with a small hole at its crown, a fire cover, the very object the bell was named for. Under it, the fire will not die, but doze, breathing slowly through its air hole, ready to be blown back into flame before dawn. Killing a fire outright is for fools, and the reason sits in a tin box on the mantel, flint, steel, and a nest of scorched linen. Striking a new fire means hacking sparks into that tinder until something catches. 3 minutes work for practiced hands on a dry evening, and on a damp February morning with fingers too cold to grip, it can steal half an hour of a person's life. The first friction match is still 100 years away. In this world, an ember is not a remnant. It is the household's stored flame, carried unbroken from day to day, the way other treasures are carried from parent to child. By 9, 8 in a hard winter, when fuel runs shorter than patience, the household is gathering to climb to bed, and before the candle is carried up, they kneel. The words they say have been said at evening prayer in every parish in England for nearly 2 centuries, and they were taken from Latin service books 1,000 years old. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night. It's worth pausing on what that sentence actually is. In the old Latin beneath it, the thing being begged away is the night's ambushes, as if the dark were not an absence but an adversary with plans. That is bedtime. Here, a family, kneeling on cold boards, formally requesting to be alive in the morning, and then rising, brushed off, entirely cheerful, to argue about who gets the warm side. The beds they climb toward are the most valuable things this family owns. Beds are bequeathed in wills, by name, the way land is. When Shakespeare left his wife their second best bed, posterity read meanness into it, but the best bed was traditionally kept fine for guests. The second best was the one the marriage had actually slept in, and leaving it to her was probably closer to tenderness than insult. Nobody in this house sleeps alone, and nobody would much want to. The parents take the big bed. The children pack together, small heaters for one another. The fire girl has the low truckle bed that rolls out beneath. Sharing was simply what a bed was for. Travellers at inns shared with strangers, and Pepys once grumbled into his diary about a colleague who was a bad bedfellow, which tells you the sharing itself was beneath comment. Only the elbows were news. The last candle is snuffed downstairs, and now comes the small nightly miracle you were promised. Reach for the rail and climb. You cannot see the stairs, and it does not matter, because your feet know them the way your tongue knows your teeth. 11 treads, the 9th one loose, the turn arriving under your hand exactly where it always arrives. Everyone in this house can walk it blind. They do it every night of their lives. In one colonial house in Maryland, you can still find a notch cut into the stair rail at the landing, a road sign for fingertips, carved by people who understood that a staircase would be read in the dark far more often than seen. Undress fast, breath faintly clouding. The warming pan has been swept between the sheets, hissing where the linen is damp, and the bed receives you cold at the edges and warm at the middle, like a pond in June. The pot is under the bed. The charm of it all is not hardship, It is competence, a family folding itself into one warm dark it knows by heart. And you would suppose, settling into that warmth with the house gone silent around you, that this is the end of the story until morning, that sleep then as now was one long unbroken dive toward daylight. Of all our assumptions about the night, that is the one these people would simply not recognize. In the summer of 1773, in a London courtroom, a witness is being asked about the events of a certain night, and she answers with a detail she clearly expects no one to question. Her husband had come home in liquor, she says, and I dare not then disturb him till he has had his first sleep. Nobody stops her. The judge does not ask what a first sleep is. The clerk writes it down without a flicker. The jury nods along because every soul in that room slept the same way. A first sleep, of course, implies a second, and that small, unexamined phrase, sitting quietly in the court record, is the door into one of the strangest forgotten facts about the pre-industrial night. Sleep came in two halves, and the halves had names, and the gap between them belonged to you. Once you know to look for the phrase, it turns up everywhere. The historian Roger E. Kirch, who first noticed it, has now gathered more than 2,000 mentions across a dozen languages, a first and second sleep in English, the same pair in French and Italian, and in Latin a lovely name for the gap itself, which translates as the mid-course of the night. What convinces is not any single reference but their tone. Nobody, anywhere, explains the term. You only define what your readers might not know, and everyone knew this. The rhythm ran roughly so, down at 9 or 10, up out of the first sleep around midnight or after, an hour or so of quiet waking, some called it the watch, then down again into the second sleep until near dawn. So let it happen to you, in the shoemaker's bed. Sometime past midnight you simply surface, easily, the way a swimmer comes up. No alarm, no jolt, no reason. The room is perfectly black and familiar down to its last inch, the fire ticking faintly under its clay dome, the wall of warm sleepers breathing beside you. And here is what may be hardest for a modern mind to feel its way into. There is no dread in this. You do not lie rigid doing arithmetic about tomorrow. Waking now is not a malfunction. It is the schedule. The hour has no duties in it, and people filled it the way you fill any hour that is truly your own. They lay still and let the dream they just left settle where they could look at it. They talked low, the way you can only talk to someone when neither of you can see the other's face. They prayed. Devotional writers of the day composed prayers specifically for the waking out of first sleep. Francis Bacon advised taking your medicine between sleeps. A French physician observed, a touch dryly, that labouring couples too spent at bedtime for anything but sleep managed matters after the first one, with, he noted, better results. And some rose, mended the fire, checked a restless animal. In these very years, a Cambridge man named Robert Sanderson kept grumbling to his diary that his dog woke him on my first sleep, so he would get up and smoke a pipe in the dark, its small coal the only lit thing in the house. 2.5 centuries later, the pattern walked into a laboratory. In the 1990s, a psychiatrist at the National Institutes of Health took around 15 young adults and gave them the one thing no modern person has: long nights. 14 hours of enforced darkness every night for a month. Their sleep stretched, then quietly broke in two. A few hours down, 1 to 3 hours of calm waking, a few hours down again. Even the blood chemistry cooperated. Prolactin, a hormone that ordinarily falls away when we get up, stayed high across the gap, as though the body counted that waking as part of its rest. It looked, irresistibly, like the old night reasserting itself the moment artificial light stepped aside. But honesty requires the complications, and here historians genuinely disagree. Smoothing that over would be its own kind of lie. Peoples living today without electricity near the equator sleep in a single block of about 6.5 hours, beginning long after sunset. Witnesses before an Antwerp court in this same century describe barely 7 hours taken all at once. Curfew himself has settled on a careful word. The two-part night was predominant, he argues, not universal. The long, dark winters of northern Europe seem to have invited the split. Whether most people lived it most nights, the scholars are still contesting, reference by reference. Yet the part that is not contested may matter more. Search this era's medical books and you find remedies in abundance for failing to fall asleep. And for waking in the middle of the night, nothing, because no one considered it an ailment. No cure was sold for it, nothing broken, nothing to fix. Only in the lit, clocked, scheduled world of the late 1800s did that waking get renamed a disorder, and we have inherited the renaming, lying stiff at 3 a.m, frightened by a state our ancestors treated as a small pause built into the dark. They had a room in the middle of the night, and we have bricked it up. Of everything this vanished world could envy us, it might be strangest that we envy them an hour of lying awake. Your own second sleep is gathering now, warm as risen bread. And as it takes you, a sound arrives through the shutter seams, thin, unhurried, somewhere below in the street. A man's voice, calling out the hour and a word about the frost, moving away down the lane at walking pace. Somebody out there is paid to be awake. Let's follow him. Slip out behind him, gently with the latch, and understand that the moment the door closes at your back, you have broken the law, not by doing anything, by being anything out here at this hour. Since the year 1285, English law has required towns to mount a night watch and empowered it to detain anyone found abroad in the dark without good cause. The offence has a name, night walking, and the offence is you. It was never enforced evenly. A gentleman stopped at midnight, offered his name and walked on. A poor man got questions and a poor woman got worse, because over the centuries the word night walker applied to women curdled into a charge of its own. A woman alone in the dark was presumed to be selling something. The night, in other words, wasn't lawless. It was governed like a border, and you have just crossed it without papers. The man you're following is the border guard, and he is nobody's idea of menace. He is old. Watchmen proverbially were, because the parish paid a pittance and got what a pittance buys, wrapped in a greatcoat, carrying a staff and a lantern paned in horn, calling the hour and the weather into streets that are asleep. 60-odd years before this night, Pepys was woken in his London bed by just such a voice, past 1 of the clock, and a cold, frosty, windy morning, and noted it with a kind of comfort. That is the odd double duty of the cry. It tells the sleepless what hour holds them, and it tells everyone the old man is still walking, still upright, still checking. He pushes on shop doors as he goes. He rattles a lock, grumbles at a shutter left loose. For a small fee, he'll hammer on your door before dawn. The town's walking alarm clock. Shakespeare put men like him on stage as fools, and the audiences howled because they knew him. And still, on a freezing night, the whole town's sleep leans quietly on the fact that somebody agreed to stay cold on its behalf. If you want to know how seriously this world took its darkness, don't ask the watchman. Open the law books. English law defined burglary as breaking into a dwelling by night, and it hanged for that what it merely whipped or transported for by day. The great commentator William Blackstone, summing up centuries of doctrine, wrote that night begins when there is no longer daylight enough to discern a man's face, and then added carefully that moonlight does not count. Think about what sits underneath that rule. The law's whole reasoning, in his words, was that the crime of the dark comes when sleep has disarmed the owner. Darkness made a person defenseless, and to strike at the defenseless was a different order of wrong. Night wasn't just a time of day to these people. It was a legal country, with its own borders and its own gallows. And yet the dark street is not the empty street. Listen, iron tires on frozen ruts, a heavy cart passing the lane's end. The carriers are already moving. Garden stuff and market goods loaded at dusk travel through the small hours, so the stalls are full at first light. The baker 2 streets over is firing his oven so that a town that went to bed in the dark can wake to warm bread. In the great towns, the licensed caste runs deeper still. The men who empty cesspools may work only after midnight, and they are no shuffling outcasts. They print handsome trade cards, promise the work decently performed, and charge so well that the trade earns twice a craftsman's wage. London with a straight face calls them gold finders, and on London's corners stand the link boys, children selling torchlight, a farthing to see a gentleman home through the black. Even they carry a shadow. A slang dictionary of 1699 preserves the word moon curser, a link boy who, under colour of lighting your way, leads you instead to the men waiting in the alley. Cursing the moon, the joke ran, because bright nights were bad for business. How often it truly happened is another matter. Historians who count the era's actual cases keep finding that the fear of the night's criminals ran well ahead of their arrest record. But fear has never read the figures, and a torch that might be loyal or might not is its own kind of dark. The honest ledger of the night's dangers looks different and duller and worse. What killed people in the dark, year upon year, was mostly water and fire. The water first. This world is laced with unfenced wells, open cellar drops, ditches, mill ponds, rivers with no parapet, and in one English county's inquest files, drowning accounts for nearly 4 in 10 of all sudden deaths. Many of them people who missed a familiar step on a familiar path, sometimes with ale's help, and went in where no one could hear. And then the fire, the reason a bell tells this town to bury its embers every night. A blaze discovered by day is an emergency. A blaze born at night has hours to feed before anyone opens an eye. In September 1666, in a bakery on Pudding Lane, a journeyman woke, the record says, with the choke of the smoke between 1 and 2 in the morning. The household got out a window and crawled along the eaves to a neighbour's roof. Their maidservant would not risk the climb and stayed and became the first death of the fire that went on to eat most of London. It began an hour after midnight in a city where everyone was asleep. Our own watchman has turned the corner now, and his lantern going down the lane is the last flame in sight. One small, taxed, mortal star at street level, guarding a town with its fires buried. Overhead is another matter entirely. Above the rooftops, this December night is hung with lights no one pays for, in numbers no one alive tonight will ever see again. And to understand what these people could do in the dark, you have to look up. When did seeing in the dark stop being a skill? It was one, once, as real as swimming, and standing here in the frozen lane, you are already, without meaning to, beginning to practice it. Given true darkness, the human eye starts a slow change that modern life almost never allows to finish. For the first few minutes, the sharpening is quick, then a deeper machinery comes online, and over half an hour, 40 minutes, an hour, sensitivity keeps climbing until the eye is many hundreds of times more capable than the one that left the firelight. The catch is that the process is fragile. One glance at a bright flame, one lit doorway, and it collapses back towards zero, which is why you, in your own century, have never completed it. There is always a screen, a headlight, a bulb, somewhere. At the last truly black places on Earth, astronomers report that Venus alone, one planet at its brightest, is enough to degrade a fully night-adjusted eye. People here finish the change every single night of their lives and live for hours at a stretch inside a sense we visit only in fragments. It is not the daytime sense with the brightness turned down. It is a different sense. Colour goes first. The night eye sees in silvers, greys and blacks a world stripped to tone. Fine detail goes with it. Print dissolves into fog, and no one ever truly read by starlight. But the world comes back in shapes you can use. The ruts of the lane, the mass of the church tower, frost glittering faintly on the paling. And the night eye comes with an instruction that every person in this town carries in their body without ever being taught it as a lesson. Don't look straight at what you want to see. The very center of your vision is blind in the dark. The eye's fine daylight machinery sits there, useless now. So the skill is to look a little beside a thing and catch it at the edge, where the night cells live. Face a faint star and it vanishes. Glance politely past it and it returns. An entire civilization knew that trick the way we know how to ride an escalator. To eyes finished like that, the moon is transformed. Measured with instruments, moonlight is nothing. An English full moon often delivers less light than a single candle a few steps away. But to the adapted eye, it is dozens of times brighter than starlight. Roads open, fields turn silver, travel becomes safe. And so the moon was infrastructure, consulted like a timetable. By the 1660s, one English family in 3 was buying almanacs, and the pages that mattered most were the tables of the moon. Dinners, assemblies, and club nights were set for the full. Later in this century, a famous fellowship of scientific minds in Birmingham, James Watt of the steam engine among them, would call itself the Lunar Society because it met on the Monday nearest the full moon so its members could see their way home. Shepherds out before dawn had a name for Venus, burning ahead of the sun, the shepherd's lamp. Nobody in this world owns a light stronger than a candle, and yet the sky keeps handing them lanterns. And such a sky. On a clear, moonless night above this town, the stars do not lie flat in their few famous shapes. They come in thousands, stacked deep and straight overhead. The Milky Way stands as an actual structure, banded, split, bright enough that watchers under the last skies like it have claimed it throws a faint shadow. Venus certainly does. Under perfect darkness, a planet can print your shadow on the ground, and photographs taken in our own time prove it. From a truly black sky, the bare eye can pick out a neighboring galaxy, a soft, slow smudge of light almost 3 million years on its way. Before sunrise, there is even a glow with legal standing, a pale cone climbing the east, sunlight scattered off the dust between the planets, so dependable that Islamic law names it the false dawn and teaches how to tell it from the true one so that the morning prayer is not begun an hour early. A light written into scripture and statute for 1,000 years. And today, for 4 out of 5 people in North America and most of Europe, the Milky Way itself is gone from the sky. It's worth sitting a moment with the question we can't answer. What would that ceiling even look like to eyes like ours? We have never once brought finished eyes to a finished sky. The night reached the ear the same way it reached the eye. When the ground cools after sunset, the air bends sound back down toward the earth instead of letting it escape upward. Sound genuinely carries farther at night. That part is physics, not nostalgia, and it carried across a silence with no engine in it anywhere on the planet. A dog 3 farms over, the knock of the mill weir, a church bell arriving thin and clear from a village you cannot see. One historian calls such sounds the oral equivalent of landmarks, and people steered by them, pausing on dark roads to stop and look at nothing and listen. A parish, in the oldest sense, was the stretch of ground that could hear its own bell. Which brings us to the era's finest navigator. John Metcalfe, Blind Jack they called him, of the Yorkshire town of Knaresborough, lost his sight to smallpox at 6 years old and grew up to work, among other things, as a guide. leading sighted travelers across moor and river country after dark, when their eyes failed and his condition stopped mattering. His old biography tells of a stranger who engaged him on a black night and was led so briskly and so surely that only at parting did the man discover his guide was blind. Darkness, the account says, being no obstruction to him. He went on to lay out 180 miles of English roads. In a world that was dark half the year, his blindness amounted to seniority. He lived full time in the country everyone else only visited. The sky has wheeled on while we stood here. It is past 2 now, and something has changed in the temperature of the night. The town's sounds have thinned away to almost nothing. Even the watchman's cry comes from far off, and then not at all. The hours ahead carried a name of their own in this world, and it was not a cosy one. The stretch between midnight and cockcrow was the dead of night, and even a level head walking home through it kept a little closer to the wall. Inside the shoemaker's house, the deepest hour of the night turns out to have sounds of its own. Timber cools and shifts. Somewhere below, a beam settles with a knock, precise and single, like a knuckle on a door. A stair tread eases itself. Something small negotiates the thatch. By daylight, nobody in this family would even hear such sounds, and at 2:30, the wife lies in the dark hearing everyone, because this is the stretch their world called the dead of night, and it is the hour when every story ever told at a winter fire gets up and walks around. An old man of this era, John Aubrey, remembered his boyhood exactly this way. The fashion, he wrote, was for old women and maids to tell fabulous stories night times of sprites and the walking of ghosts. The stories were entertainment at 7 in the evening. They collect their fee at 2 in the morning. It would be comfortable to imagine that this fear belonged to the uneducated, and that the learned smiled at it from above. The record shows nothing of the kind. It was a fashionable London writer who called the night the devil's black book, in which he keeps his accounts of us. Preachers taught in earnest that darkness was the devil's working shift. In 1681, a Fellow of the Royal Society, the very academy of the new science, published a thick volume defending the reality of ghosts and witches, built from the sworn testimony of respectable clergymen, aimed squarely at the doubters. And 9 years before our December night, in a rectory in Lincolnshire, one of the most famous households in English religious history spent 2 winter months living with a thing they could not explain. Knockings that answered in patterns, latches that lifted themselves, a mastiff that whimpered before each outbreak began. The children, unafraid enough to be witty about it, named the presence Old Geoffrey, and because the noises came loudest during prayers for King George, the family teased that their ghost must be a Jacobite. The letters they wrote about it all survive. One of the sons, away at school through that strange winter, grew up to found Methodism. Whatever was happening in that house, the point stands. Fear of the night's spirits ran straight to the top of the age's mind and lived comfortably alongside its intelligence. What did people do with such fear, lying in the dark with no switch to reach for? They managed it, and the managing had equipment. In 1655, a writer on witchcraft recorded an old Essex woman who had blessed her bed every night since Queen Mary's reign with the same small verse. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the bed be blessed that I lie on. 4 names, 4 corners of the bed, a watcher posted at each. The Reformation had officially swept such charms away a century earlier. The old woman had kept hers, and she was not alone, because a sentence that guards your sleep is not surrendered on doctrinal grounds. Children were issued their own version, and it is worth hearing what it actually says. If I should die before I wake. A line printed for young readers within a dozen years of our night, teaching them to fold the largest fear of all into rhyme and then sleep on it. Beyond words, there were plainer tools. Company first. Nobody in this house faces the dead of night alone. A knife or a cudgel within reach, common enough that historians keep finding it. The banked fire showing one small red eye across the room. And underneath it all, a truth this family would never phrase, but certainly lived by. Some of that fear was load-bearing. In a world where the dark genuinely drowned travelers and hid real men with real knives, the dread that kept you home after midnight was, on balance, doing you a service. The wife, listening to the settling beam, is not a primitive mind malfunctioning. She is a reasonable person running the oldest security system there is. And the part we don't say out loud is that we still run it, standing a moment longer than we need to, checking the dark corner of a room we know is empty. Yet fear never had those hours to itself. A few doors down the lane, another wakeful figure lies listening just as hard and dreading nothing. She is waiting, and what she is waiting for arrives as 3 small stones against her window glass. This too was an institution of the dark. Across Wales and New England and plenty of country in between, courting happened at night, in the house, in the bed. The suitor admitted quietly, the couple lying clothed under the blankets, talking for hours, sometimes with a board set down the middle as a formality both parties understood. Parents knew, parents in many cases approved, and their reasoning was the same arithmetic that governs everything else in this world. The bed was the only warm, half-private room the house possessed, and a courtship needs somewhere to happen. If matters went further than talk and a child began, the wedding simply moved up the calendar, and the community, having managed young people longer than it had managed candles, mostly absorbed it. Meanwhile, apprentices were forever over the workshop wall after curfew, bound for an alehouse or a girl or plain freedom, and the age's court records groan with them. The unsupervised hours belong to the young then exactly as they belong to the young now. The dark that made their elders pray was, one lane over, cover, privacy, and the only kingdom they had. Hold the 2 houses in one frame for a moment. A woman whispering 4 names to the corners of her bed, and a girl easing a cold casement open with her heart going like a drum. Terror and tenderness, keeping the same hours, sheltering under the same darkness. If you lay awake in it yourself, you would recognize all of it. The bargaining, the listening, the hoping. They're 2 in the morning, and ours are the same creature, and they met it, on the whole, with more grace than we manage with the lights on. The 4 watchers hold the bed through what remains, and they are still on duty when it comes. The moment the window panes turn from perfect black to a grey, the eye can just barely tell apart. First light, touching the bedposts before it has even found the town. The first cock has been calling since well before the light, with the tireless self-importance of his kind, but what actually wakes you is a sound from below, the scrape of fired clay on stone. The girl is up, kneeling at the hearth, lifting the cover off the embers. Under its dome, the fire has drowsed all night on its stored heat, and now she gives it what it has been waiting for, a handful of dry kindling and her own breath, steady and patient, until a coal, the colour of a winter sunrise, remembers what it is and stands up into flame. No flint this morning, no cold half-hour of striking sparks. The fire that was covered is uncovered. The flame nobody let die is handed on into another day, the way it was handed to yesterday, and to the year before, and to years before that. Warmth and light come back into the house the way breath comes back to a sleeper, and the house surfaces around them. The second sleep releases its holders one by one, the shoemaker groaning upright, the children burrowing deeper in protest and being hauled out by ankle and argument, someone hunting a shoe the dark has hidden in plain sight. The water in the basin wears a skin of ice, and washing in it produces the same gasps and the same bad language it would produce in us. Yesterday's bread, a short grace, boots, and then the bar lifting from the door, and all along the street shutters are swinging back, each window handing the town a little of the morning, until the whole lane that closed last night like an eye has opened again. Watch them a moment before we go, teasing, complaining, planning, the wife already 3 tasks ahead of everyone. And notice that in 16 hours of deep winter night, you have not seen a single thing that needed translating. They crossed the dark the way their parents crossed it, on skill and company and a banked fire, and came out the far side into an ordinary morning. That crossing, repeated nightly for most of human history, is one of the great unrecorded achievements of ordinary people. Our one night in 1725 was one of tens of thousands like it, and the world that held them was already at its edges, beginning to change. Paris had hung candle lanterns over its streets by royal order decades before. London's grand squares kept their few weak oil lamps. Out here, none of that had arrived, and for nearly everyone on Earth, the dark was still whole. Then the pace picked up. In 1807, a showman lit London's Pall Mall with gas, piped through iron gun barrels left over from war, and crowds came just to stand in it. Yet the new light spread with telling reluctance. An early gas jet burned scarcely brighter than a dozen candles, and for decades many towns lit their lamps at full strength only on moonless nights. The moon, that old unpaid employee, stayed on the municipal payroll deep into the modern age. In 1881, a small Surrey mill town called Godalming became the first place in the world with a public electricity supply, a water wheel spinning a dynamo on the river. 3 years later, unimpressed and out of pocket, it went back to gas, and electric light did not return for nearly 20 years. British farms, many of them, waited for the wire until the 1950s and 60s. There are people alive now who remember the night their kitchen first came on. And then, having taken 2 long centuries to dim the dark, we overshot it in 2 generations. The sky above our heads has lately been brightening by nearly 10% a year. A child born tonight where 250 stars are visible will come of age under 100. And the drifting hardware of our satellites now glows faintly over every point on the planet, so that nowhere on Earth, not mid-ocean, not the deep desert, keeps a fully natural night. In 2023, astronomers felt obliged to coin a word for what this costs. Noctalgia, they proposed. Sky grief. So it is worth standing still here at the end of the night and refusing both of the easy verdicts. The story we have just lived through is not a tale of misery redeemed by the light bulb, and it is not a lament for some realer, richer dark we ought to want back. Either one flattens the family we stayed with. They did not experience their nights as deprivation, and the dark did not ennoble them. They were simply making a life from what their moment offered, exactly as we do, with the same appetites and worries and jokes, the same wish to be warm and together until morning. The ledger runs honestly in both directions. We would not hand back the streetlight that sees a daughter home, the hospital that never goes dark, the small switch that has quietly retired a whole world of drowned travellers and burned down towns. And they held things it costs us something to name, a waking hour at midnight that no one feared, eyes allowed to finish what they started, a sky so deep the law had to account for it, the habit of sharing an evening's light the way you'd share bread. They were not better than us, and they were not worse. We did not earn the brightness we live inside. We were only born later. Luckier is all. What the people of that long night might ask of us is not admiration, and certainly not pity, only the recognition that they were us, and that they managed, in the dark, to be everything people are. Tonight, at some point, you will put the lights out. The room that follows will not be very dark. It never is now. A glow will hold under the door, and the small standby lights will keep their watch. But somewhere beyond the glass, the old night is still out there, arriving on schedule, patient as ever, and still wearing a few of its stars. It is the same night they knew. Only the light between you has changed. They crossed it 10,000 times, with a bell and an ember and 4 whispered names. It carried them every night to morning. It will carry you too. Sleep well.